everyone, welcome to our last biology video of the school year. You've made it. You gotta just make it through one more, okay? Biodiversity is the topic of this. We're gonna talk about what is biodiversity, what are some threats to biodiversity, and what are we doing about it? So biodiversity is basically what different organisms exist, the diversity of biology, different organisms that exist, different species, different ecosystems, places that those animals live, and different genes that exist, even within populations, can all be considered biodiversity. So, biodiversity is the variety of life that exists here on Earth. There are many different threats to biodiversity, and unfortunately, those threats can lead to extinction. We're going to go through and talk about those threats, and then we're going to talk about some things that we can do to try to overcome those threats. So don't worry, it's not all negative. These are the threats: endangered species, habitat alternation, demand for wildlife products, pollution, and introduced species that do not naturally live in a certain area. Let's talk about endangered species and extinction. Once a species is endangered, that reduces the genetic diversity within that population, and that can cause some issues in terms of biodiversity, because when we limit the number of genes in a population, that population becomes more susceptible to things like disease and parasites. But when we actually have a species that goes extinct or disappears completely from Earth, that completely eliminates that entire species, that entire line of genes from the Earth, from the surface of the Earth. And so we're doing a lot of things to try to help conserve and protect some of our endangered species and bring them back so that they will not go extinct. Habitat alteration is another huge threat to biodiversity, because when we are changing the habitats that organisms used to live in, they don't have their home anymore. And they can become endangered because of the changes we're making to their habitat. Some habitats are disappearing altogether, and some are just being broken into pieces. So you could see, like, this used to be one big forest habitat, and now it is broken into pieces by this neighborhood. Now, sometimes we are doing things to try to help with that. So, where we have an interstate here, we've built a land bridge to try to help different organisms reach one side or the other of the highway without being killed by vehicles. But is it always enough? We're not sure. Another threat to biodiversity here on Earth is the demand for wildlife products. We overhunt for food and other products, and that has actually led to several extinctions and endangered species. And it threatens not only those organisms that we're hunting, but also all of the organisms in the food chain. One in particular species that we've been doing this to, or a group of species that we've been doing this to, is sharks. So there's a huge demand in certain countries for shark fin soup. And for that reason, humans have hunted and taken off the fins from sharks. And that is starting to damage not only the shark population, but also, because sharks are an apex predator, that's damaging the entire food web in the ocean. At the end of this presentation, I'll come back and I'll show this trailer for shark water extinction so you can get to see a better look at how the demand for wildlife products is shaping Earth. And if you want to watch it, you can. If you don't, you don't have to. Next thing that is a threat to biodiversity and life on Earth is pollution. That's pollution of air, water, and soil. The biggest thing that is bad about it is that there's this thing called biological magnification. Basically, the concentration of pollutants increases at the higher trophic levels. And it increases usually on a scale of 10. So if you think about those ecological pyramids that we talked about, like the energy pyramid and the biomass pyramid and the pyramid of numbers, how they kind of decrease by a factor of 10. Well, the concentration of different pollutants increases by a factor of 10 as you move up the food web. So here's an example: is DDT. DDT is a chemical that used to be used to treat against insects, and it got into our waterways. It started affecting, the zooplankton, which are some of the smallest organisms, but then the zooplankton were eaten by fish. So the DDT started to affect fish, and then it started to infect or affect our predatory birds and other large apex predators and damage their populations, even from just starting at the very bottom of the food chain. It worked its way up and it magnified to really cause serious harm to our apex predators. You can see that here in this kind of graphic or here in the chart that is actually kind of similar to a biomass pyramid, but just shows that DDT or chemical concentration can start and seem kind of low, but at every trophic level, it's going to increase in concentration and then really, really hurt the apex predators, things like sharks and birds. The next thing that can damage a population or cause a threat to biodiversity is introduced species. These are also known as invasive species, and they're non-native organisms that do not have any sort of predators or parasites. They in the land wherever they were originally from, they had predators or parasites that kind of kept their population in check. But once they've come to a new place, they might not have those predators. Right now, we're seeing that in the news. If you've heard of the murder hornets, those are hornets that have come here on shipping containers, and they are destroying the bee population in the Northwest. And they aren't, able to be kept in check here because they don't have natural predators here. Whereas in Asian countries where they originally came from, they had natural predators. The same sort of thing has happened with stink bugs. Also, kudzu is something that you've seen. It's not native to the United States, but it was brought here actually as a way to try to help with soil erosion. But it's grown up over trees and it blocks our native trees and causes them damage. Lionfish are another type of invasive species. They were brought here in the aquarium trade. People had them in their fish tanks, and then they decided these fish are getting too big. And not only that, but they're also killing my fish in my fish aquarium. Let me just dump them in the ocean. So when they dumped them in the ocean, those lionfish didn't have any natural predators there, and they started killing many different fish species at coral reefs, and that has caused huge problems to the point that now we actually purposely hunt lionfish in our reef ecosystem to try to keep them in check, because we realized what we've done by putting them in nature when they're where they were not supposed to be. Pythons and anacondas are doing a similar thing in Florida. People got them as pets. They saw that they grew so big, they no longer wanted them. They released them into the wild. And now those pythons are threatening the biodiversity in places like Florida because they're eating a lot of prey species and there are no natural predators there to keep them in check. So, just like the lionfish, we've started hunting lionfish more. We've actually started hunting these pythons and anacondas more to try to eliminate them because we realized we made a mistake releasing them as a non-native organism into a certain area and that they've become an invasive species. Ozone depletion is another threat to biodiversity. Ozone depletion is basically reducing the ozone layer, which protects us from the sun's very strong rays and keeps our Earth at a relatively cool temperature. And the ozone layer used to be very, very large, say back in the 80s, but with the use of certain chemicals in industry, we have depleted our ozone layer pretty low. Now, recently, we have started to realize what we were doing and that we were causing harm to the ozone layer by using certain chemicals and also with certain pollutants. And so we have started to try to put limitations on that for ourselves. And since we've done that, there's been a slightly upward trend in the ozone layer. The ozone layer is kind of mending itself. And there is some hope that as people are stuck inside due to COVID-19, that the ozone layer might be able to continue healing. But if the ozone layer were to become depleted, that can cause global climate change because now our Earth is going to warm up. The ice caps could melt, which could cause problems for native species there, like polar bears, but also could cause an increase in water level, which would flood some of our coastal cities like New York City. What can we do about all this? I know so far in this presentation, I've sounded kind of like, oh gosh, there's all these bad things going on, but how can we help? So, we can do different conservation efforts. We want to manage our natural resources in an effort to protect individual species and whole entire ecosystems. So, if we manage our natural resources and we are careful about how much we are using of those natural resources, then that can increase biodiversity. We conserve the animals and we conserve the ecosystems that they live in, we can increase biodiversity. Now, there is some pushback there because industry can suffer and it costs money to do conservation. So some people are not in favor of some of these conservation efforts because of the money that it could cost them in industry. But if you want Earth to remain a good place to live over a long period of time, we've got to consider conservation efforts. What can you do on a small scale? Well, use your materials and energy wisely. Don't go driving around just for the heck of it, because that's using a non renewable resource of gas to power your car, right? Or don't leave the water running in your sink. That's not wise use of materials and energy. You can recycle or even reuse, which is even better than recycling materials. You know from our classroom that we're working on recycling in the school, but if you can reuse, that's even better. Like have a reusable water bottle, like a hydro flask, right? You can help with conservation efforts by doing that on a very small scale. It's not too difficult. You can decrease the amounts that you use of any natural resource. Just be mindful of how much you're using. And when possible, use alternative forms of energy and materials. So if you were to build a new house in, say, like 10 years, maybe you would consider installing solar panels on your roof because solar is a renewable resource, whereas natural gas and electricity that comes from coal mining are not renewable. So think about alternative forms of energy and materials that you could use in your own home. Thank you so much for listening.